Okay, well, thank you to those online and here for being here. I'm going to talk about a slightly strange topic. I gave Francesco a couple of ideas of what I could talk about, and he picked the strangest one. So that's great. I don't know if we can reduce the light in front, but if not, that's fine. So I'm going to talk about some recent work that I've been doing on understanding. Actually, it's not that recent. But this talk is based on a paper I wrote recently. But I've always been interested in how we can tell apart what's real and what's not real, right? So when I talk about the reality fiction distinction, I'm talking about how we, immerse ourselves in films, movies, and so on, and we can really enjoy it. It can emotionally move us to cry, laugh, feel fear, and so on. And then when the experience is done, we kind of snap out of it. And it's kind of intriguing from a psychological and neuroscientific standpoint. How does that really happen? Okay. And those are not the only ways in which, of course, we engage in fiction. We do it through gaming nowadays as well. You can do it collectively with other people. And it starts very early on in childhood when children engage in pretend play. So it's an active part of how we spend our time, our energy, our money, and so on, is to jump into fictional worlds. So a lot of my focus for a long time has been to understand how we can tell it apart so instantaneously, okay? So a lot of what I'm going to say has been covered in the paper that I showed you there. And the paper kind of explores a lot of things that I can't go into here. Just how do we understand, how we come to understand the nature of our real world, how this is similar to and different from how we understand fictional worlds. The conditions whereby fiction influences the manner in which we view our own world, yeah? In what way fictional experiences, the different mediums there are, impact our understanding of the world. The significance of fiction is very close to what we experience or not in terms of how we really construct our real world. And essentially, whether the structure of changes of fictional experiences essentially changes a lot about the way we see our world. Okay, so I'll get into some of that, but for anyone who wants to explore it more closely, just read the paper. So the first question, of course, is what is reality? There's a lot of work, all of psychology is really about understanding how we make sense of worlds. An old model is our so-called SOR model, stimulus, or you have senses taking in information from the world that impinge on our minds in a specific way. The black box there is the organism, what happens in our mind as the information comes in. And depending on the information we are taking in, we might have a response that we undertake. Yeah. Dominant models now, when I'm trying to understand the human mind, all taking this a step further and all kind of assume there's some sort of receptive predictive cycle to the way the brain works, okay? We take in information and that information feeds our knowledge about to predict about what's happening next, right? And so I can show you a kind of tidy example of how quickly this works. Anyone, you can see this image and do you know what you're seeing? Anyone here? Hopefully not. If you haven't seen it before, it might be hard. So it's kind of degraded image of a picture of a frog, okay? Now, the cool thing about this is, once I show you that image again, now your brain has essentially taken that sensory information and understood it, and now forever when you see this picture, you will readily see a frog. So that's what we mean by the receptive predictive loops that the brain essentially oversees, okay? But of course, there's all sorts of things that happen in our minds that don't necessarily involve an external stimulus. Just think about the last time you might have driven for a long period. Your mind switches off. Even when you're doing something as complex as driving, you tend to mind wander very often. And so you have processes that really just take place in your mind without necessarily being tied to stimulus. It can be, but not necessarily so. So what we have is the brain that is kind of built and developed and evolved for receptive predictive cycles to be also co-opted for generative explorative cycles. Yeah, the space of the imagination. Let me show you another example of how this works. And see if you can make sense of this, what you're experiencing when you look at this. Now, hopefully you're able to, sort of, you saw something narrative happening there. You attributed some emotions to the little figures there. It's kind of insane that our minds do that, if you just think about it. You haven't seen this display before. Just by seeing moving, simple geometric figures in kind of unpredictable ways, what your brain has done is to generate hypotheses, explore what they are, and really just generate a whole narrative. And it's not really particularly social information, but you read intentionality and all into it. It's a very old study from 1944, the classic Hyder and Simmel studies that show that our minds need very little to start attributing really complex causality to very simple things that are kind of perplexing to us and we don't immediately understand what's going on. Yeah, but we push for understanding and come up with hypotheses. The question is, why do we do this? Right? Why do we attribute causality when there's no reason to do so? One of the major hypotheses there, I think, which kind of explains a little bit, was what the philosopher Daniel Dennett came up with, in that he tried to explain how we make sense of the world through three stances. Our brains are quick and efficient. That's what it's sort of incentivized to be at the, let's say, and so that's why it's not 100% accurate all the time, but it is very quick and very efficient. It's accurate most of the time, yeah? And that's because we use one of three what we call dirty stances, okay? If we're doing something, if we see a temporally extended event happen, we first try to say, well, one of the stances we could apply is a physical stance. So for instance, if I take a pencil or a pen and let it go, I have some sense of folk physics that I developed from when I'm an infant, and I can understand the behavior of what's happening by a physical stance, by physical properties of the world around me. Folk physics, that's a physical stance. Sometimes not everything can be explained by a physical stance. I might have to take what's called a design stance. Yeah, I don't really know how a computer works, really. But I know that it's designed to work in a specific way. I don't know how a kettle really works, but I know that it's been designed for that purpose. When I look at anything that doesn't fit with a physical or a design stance, I automatically take what is called an intentional stance. I attribute intentionality, agency, goal-directedness to the events in front of me, okay? Artists have known this for a long time. So movie makers who do horror films, for instance, who directed, make scripts out of that, they kind of work on the intentional stance a lot. You know, suddenly windows blow open, things happen that are unexpected. We don't think of it as a physical or a design thing. We think of it as intentional. We're scared because we're thinking there's some agentic agent tendencies there, okay? So, what is reality? Well, we know for sure, and I really recommend people read this book if you want to get a sense of how we make sense of our reality, is that it's definitely not objective, okay? I'm going to read this quote directly from Mr. Hope. He says, the different information coming in from our senses, visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory sensations are processed at different regions in the brain. They have to travel at different distances. So a tickle at your foot has to travel further to reach the brain than the tickle at your chest. And it arrives at the brain at different times. The processing speed of the different kinds of stimuli also varies. Visual stimuli take longer to process than other stimuli. The difference here is about 50 milliseconds. To compare, a single syllable takes about 200 milliseconds, okay? On the other hand, light travels much faster than sound. So putting together these different speeds means that sights and sounds from about 10 meters away are available to consciousness at about the same time. For anything closer or further away, information about that sight and sound arrives at different times, okay? So in these cases, the apparent simultaneity of, for instance, hearing a voice and seeing a speaker's lips move has to be constructed by our brain. In addition, incoming sensory information has to be screened for relevance very quickly. So the roar of a tiger behind us has to be attended to more quickly than the chirping of the bird in front of us, okay? At the same time, thoughts and memories have to be processed. Yet, a coherent, unified world emerges from this mess of data almost all of the time. And when this breaks down seems to be kind of consistently only in the case of certain psychiatric disorders or when using hallucinogenic drugs, okay? So what this really means is that nearly every aspect of our understanding of the world in relation to matter, people, space, or time involves some form of construction on the part of the perceiver, okay? So that's my mini introduction to reality. What about fiction? When I'm talking about fiction, I'm really talking about the perception of the recipient, someone who's reading fiction, not the person who's really creating it. That's a different thing. But what about us, people who engage in fiction, trying to partake of it, but through reading, through movies, and so on? Yeah. Of course, there are many, many differences in the types of fiction in terms of the mediums, the forms which can differ a lot between cultures, whether it's possible or probable relative to reality, the modality, whether it's unimodal or multimodal, and so on, whether it involves an active or passive participation from the recipient, and so on. So there's many, 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 many types of fiction. It's very, very diverse, yeah? But we know for sure is that it exists in all cultures, and it's known to every single era and that we have historical records for, okay? The story form, the narrative form of fiction has always kind of existed, at least in known history, okay? We know a lot of this from archaeology, of course, and it's a capacity that develops very early in childhood, okay? We start as young children, babies, to engage with it kind of passively. So it could be caretakers telling you stories, explaining things around you. And then very, very quickly, we start to engage in it quite actively, yeah? Through play, through books, through games, and then in quite complex mediums, through theater, and so on. Now, when I first got into it, there were a couple of papers that made the hugest difference to my understanding of reality and fiction. One was this kind of a comment on a bigger paper by Pascal Boyer, where he said, we're not going to get to the truth of understanding what's the difference between reality and fiction by looking at them as dualities like that. We have to consider other factors. And he proposed, for instance, that you need a couple of other vectors that you need to think about. One that he proposed is something intuitive or counterintuitive. Okay? And he gave a great example here of, for instance, magic is a case where something is happening right in front of you. Like, I don't know, a magician takes a rabbit out of a hat. So it's coming, you're seeing it, it's real because it's not a fooling of your senses. However, it's totally counterintuitive. It just doesn't make sense that this is real. Right? On the other hand, it's pretend play. When a child pretends that a banana is a phone, yeah, it's unreal, but it makes sense. It's intuitive. We don't think of this as very, very strange. So he introduced ways to think about fiction that go beyond thinking of it as objectively real or unreal, fitting in with the construction notions of before. There's tons of insights we have from developmental psychology. This is where they try to understand from young children, when does this capacity develop? When can they tell that something is real and something is not real? So I pick an example of a paper that had a huge influence on me when I started working on this. Just this one, just does Batman think, what does Batman think about SpongeBob, basically? Now, they did this kind of ingenious study where they had children make decisions, yeah, about 3 levels of fiction and reality. And what they were able to show was as young as 4 years old, children have incredibly sophisticated understanding of the distinction between reality and fiction. And they did this by asking them 3 types of questions. In one type of situation, they were assessing whether the child can tell whether reality is different from fiction by asking them, for instance, here's a fictional world, Batman. Is Batman real to you? Yeah. And that's an explicit question. Children at 4 don't necessarily understand explicit questions. So you also ask, psychologically, you want to ask them a question that they will you want to be sure that they definitely understand it. So you can say, ask an implicit question, but assumes reality. Can you touch Batman? The correct response, if you understand that reality and distinct fiction are distinct, is no, yeah, for both. They also ask children to make within-world distinctions. So they might know that Batman doesn't exist in our world, but they know that there's an internal coherence in Batman's world. Yeah. So they asked about what happens in Batman's world. Is Robin real to Batman? Or can Robin talk to Batman? Can Batman talk to Robin? In those cases, of course, if you have an adequate understanding of different worlds as having a sort of a logic within themselves, and some things are possible within worlds, They would say yes to. And finally, they wanted to see whether there's in narrative psychology, there's an understanding that perhaps children just put all of fiction together in one big lump. Yeah. So they went to test for that. So they asked, for instance, these two distinct fictional worlds that they asked questions about. Is SpongeBob real to Batman, or can Batman talk to SpongeBob? Obviously, if they had maintained that these are distinct worlds, they would say no to both. Okay. So this is what they found. They asked adults as well, and they found adults are very can easily tell the difference. That they know that fantasy is make-believe to reality, and so on. And within worlds, that there's a reality there. So Robin is real to Batman, and they also show, of course, that SpongeBob is not real to Batman, or vice versa. And what they found was that the 4-year-olds essentially show the same pattern as the adults. They're a little bit better on the explicit questions, which are shown in the implicit questions, right, which they call action here, which they show in dark pink, I think that it looks like. But in essence, it's the same as the adults. So what they were able to show is that children as young as 4 really have an understanding that's pretty equivalent to adults about what's real and what's not real. Okay. The question is why that is. One of the biggest, I think, amazing researchers in the fields of narrative comprehension and how we build stories is Brian Boyd, an English literature professor. And this is a wonderful paper, and he's written wonderful books as well. And this is kind of what he points out. Why are we able to do this? Yeah. And why does it happen? Why does story take, what is it about stories that are really important to our worlds? So he said, once the strong existing disposition to play that humans have, combined with existing capacities for event comprehension, memory, imagination, language, and narrative, we could begin to invent fiction and to explore the full range of human possibilities in concentrated, engaging, memorable forms. First language, then narrative, then fiction created niches that altered selection pressures and made us ever more deeply dependent on knowing more about our kind and our risks and opportunities than we could ever discover through direct experience. Okay, so stories are powerful, and he would argue that stories are a kind of technology. And in this, he takes from Daniel Dorr, who wrote this incredible book called Instruction of Imagination. And Dorr has this quote. He says, "We first invented language, and then language changed us." Yeah. Roy takes it further. He says, to adapt Dorr's dictum, we first invented stories, and then they changed us. A way to think about it is we invented smartphones, and now having a smartphone, living in the world of smartphones has changed us in terms of the way we communicate with each other, we socialize, we think about our realities, and so on, okay? That these are actual real technologies. And the thing is, you might have evolved storytelling for something, but now it changes the way we are. So this brings me to like reality fiction interactions. There's a lot of work on children, kind of fascinating work about how dynamic it is that these worlds interact with one another. This is one of the old, one of the earliest papers, really influential in the fields, Jacqueline Woolley's idea, to show that all fantasies are not equally distinct from reality. Yeah. Any fantasy element that kind of engages within your own reality is seen as more real. So when you study children, children understand that both are distinct, let's say, but they see Santa Claus as more real. They see the Tooth Fairy as more real. Why? Because certain fictional characters enter our spaces more than others. This is not just a thing that, oh, it's more real. It actually has an active effect on the way people think about the world. So for instance, if you come from a religious background compared to a secular background, this influences how you can reason or learn from fiction, okay? So this is a kind of cool study where they found that children who went to church or enrolled in some sort of parochial school or both judged people in religious stories to be a real person, okay? Whereas kids who were not brought up in that background ended to think of religious protagonists as fictional, all right? So you might think, oh, that's fine, that fits with the worldview of what they're being taught, but actually has a knock-on effect on what knowledge they can gain as being relevant to their world, yeah? Because children are more likely to generalize content that they're learning from a fictional world if it is similar to what they believe to be reality, okay? Furthermore, they're less likely to transfer problem solutions, yeah, from fantasy stories that are really far away from their reality than things that are close to their reality, okay? So if you fundamentally define the way you can consider what stories are fictional, what stories are not, it has a knock-on effect on the way you see the world, okay? I don't want to suggest at all that the way we engage with fiction is passive, all right? There's lots of really cool studies that show that. So this one, for instance, is looking at how we engage with genres when we think of watching movies and so on, and they divide it up into different types, like communal, aesthetic, thrilling, dark, or cerebral, depending on the kind of conduct. And they looked at personality variables and so on that predict what kind of entertainment you're going to seek out. And what they found, for instance, was that people are not at all passive recipients of fiction, okay? What we do very often is to seek out entertainment preferences that reflect and reinforce parts of our personality. And this is not just for films, by the way, it's also for books, all right? We might think, okay, there are good readers, there are big readers, and so on. But actually, it's pretty nuanced. Among heavy book readers, if you look at what they do when they carry books around, they find there's an enormous sort of social sort of uses happening there, yeah? So book usage is not just spending time in the activity of reading, which is pretty individual and introverted. Books can help users express their identity in social interaction. And I mean, if you think about it, if you have books at home, what books do you buy? What do you put on your bookshelves and so on? We do take very intentional choices there about what we want to reflect about ourselves, okay? We take this further after we even use fiction for sort of parasocial relationships. Like let's say you and your partner lack a common social circle. This kind of study found that you can use fiction to create a shared social space, yeah? Through books, through films, yeah? It compensates for a deficit you might have in your social life as not having common friends and so on, yeah? But that doesn't stop us from feeling like we have a wider social circle, okay? So given that really a lot of how we can tell what is fiction is very similar to reality and they're so strongly intertwined, how are we able to tell fiction apart from reality? This is what I explored in that paper in great detail. And there are many possible explanations that have been put forward. First is the so-called medium level explanations. This has been quite an old theory, which is that you know it's fictional because it's not right in front of you, you're getting it through the medium of a book or a screen somehow. And that worked well till we started to all use smartphones as an explanation, because now people get a lot of their real content, yeah, whether it's communications from their families, anything real to you, from having a phone. So the medium itself is not an indication that something is fictional. Another explanation is that there's a world level explanation. The fictional worlds look so different from our world. And so there's something about the world itself that is distinct, and that's what tells us that it is. But this might be true for some types of fiction. It certainly doesn't explain all fiction, right? There's a lot of fiction that's very close to the way we experience the world. So like the world of James Bond is pretty much the same as our world. There's nothing unusual about it except for a few things that he has some gadgets, for instance, yeah? So that's not adequate to explain how we can readily tell them apart. Some would say it's a context level explanation. So let's say I might assume that everything about the world of Paddington, I don't know if you've seen it, I'm just assuming you have, is the same as what happens in London, only that there is a bear. And that context is enough to tell me that if there's a bear running through London, that's what makes it different. But just as I gave the James Bond example, that's not all the time different. The context is not always, you can have a story that you create in the real moment about somebody in Atlanta, and it would still be a story. And you can still tell apart that it's not real, for instance. There's perspective level explanation saying you did not write the content. You know that it's fictional because it didn't come from your mind, yeah? But that would be saying that people like authors wouldn't be able to tell apart what is real and not real from what they themselves have created. And the next final thing is that there's representational level of explanation. Some of my own neuroscientific work kind of pointed to this for a long time, which is that there's something about the characters themselves that are coded differently in your minds, okay? But we know that that's also not true, yeah? So what I proposed was a so-called Blinks model, okay? To try and explain away the difference between the reality fiction distinction. And what I found through all of my psychological neuroscientific work is that it's implicit. There's something that just seeing it tells us about it, yeah? And so I propose that it can be explained by the fact that fictional worlds relative to reality are bounded. So let's say, taking one of my favorite books by there, Middlemarch, everything I know about the book is in that book. Everything about that book is in that book, yeah? Unlike reality, which is unbounded, you're learning new things every day about the world. Fictional worlds are fundamentally bound, even if they have like eight, I don't know, 8 volumes of a Harry Potter series or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's still contained. It's still limited compared to reality. Reality is unlimited. Okay, that's something that tells you that it's fiction. Another thing from going from that is also kind of inference light. A writer, for instance, never introduces you to things that are absolutely unnecessary. It either is there for the narrative purpose, telling you the story, setting the scene in some way, the mood, and so on. Unlike reality, where I don't know what you're thinking, and I have to infer a lot about what's happening to make sense of the world. I don't have to infer that much when I have to infer relatively less comparatively in a fictional context. It's also curated. Someone has written it and is directing you and telling you what to pay attention to and what you don't have to pay attention to. Yeah? And of course, it's sparse for the same reasons. Yeah? You might know a lot about, I don't know, if you're reading Lord of the Rings, about the woods and so on, but not all the characters are equally explored. It's very, very sparse. You need to know only what you need to know. Okay? So that's what I kind of proposed here in the Blinks model. It's B for bounded, Lin for inference light, C for curated, and S for sparse, okay? So essentially, not being able to tell reality apart. Yeah, so we come to the next one after this, but I don't know if we have time to keep going. Yeah. Do we? Oh, good. So what does this mean for how we can or cannot tell things apart? Now, you know, when I started doing this work, we weren't in some sort of post-truth kind of world, you know. And so suddenly I've realized that I'm doing things that seem to be interesting in a much wider perspective that is of societally relevant. What happens when you can't tell apart reality from fiction, okay? Now, the truth is we really cannot tell apart in some ways what is, in very specific ways, what they are. I can't tell them apart because if you can, if the world is completely different, like in the case of a fiction world like Star Wars and so on, that's a little bit different. But we have the inherent features of our mind that kind of push us in very specific ways to think of something as believable, not because it exists, but because it's plausible or intuitive. A lot of work on reasoning, for instance, has shown us this. So if you compare these kinds of syllogisms, okay, valid syllogism that's valid and believable, 89% will say that the conclusion is correctly. If you compare that to invalid, unbelievable conclusions, 10% will say it's not correct. It is correct, which is also correct, which is also true. The interesting ones are in between, okay? Even when told this is a purely logical reasoning task, people find it very difficult to accept conclusions that don't fit with their views, okay? This is a very neutral example. No nutritional things are expensive. Some vitamin tablets are inexpensive. Therefore, some vitamin tablets are not nutritional. Only around 50% would say that that is a correct conclusion, okay? Why isn't it higher? It's because the conclusion is kind of unbelievable. So if you have a belief in place, that screws with your ability to tell apart what's real and what's not real, for instance, okay? Now, this kind of works the way it does because of the way we infer, we generate inferences. And there's a lot of work that we know from narrative comprehension how we do this, right? So, not to get into it in great detail, we have data and our experiences, but we select the data from what we observe. We're editors of our own thought processes in big ways, and that affects the way we see what's plausible, what's real, what's unreal, and so on. Now, there are some really cool examples of how you can test for comprehension, right? So what I've showed you is that we're really biased by our intuitions about what's real. If you think about what's real or unreal in our environment in terms of news feeds and so on. This was a kind of cool study where they're looking at visual narrative comprehension, okay? So these are the kind of examples you could have. You show frames, and what's really important is this action star that hides what is happening in the scene, and then you have something that follows it, okay? Or you can have a situation where there's no action star and the narrative is kind of clear. Nothing is hidden from you. So this is a coherent sort of an establisher, an initial action, a peak action, something happens that you can or cannot see, and the release, the final end of how that little mini story ends, okay? So in this experiment, they did those as well as scrambled versions of those, okay? So this is an example of a coherent scene. There's a critical panel, which is either the depicted scene or an action star. And then that scene scrambled, which actually should not make much sense to you, yeah? When they asked people how easy were the strips to understand for scrambled content and coherent content, obviously the coherent scenes were the most easy to understand for people, that's obvious. But the next most coherent things were the ones with the stars, where it was absent, so critical information was missing, but it was we could still find coherence there, even though it was information was missing, because we were able to fill it in, okay? So why is that interesting? Because in fiction, writers exploit that a lot. They know how to create a little more tension, yeah, to make you feel a story is more interesting. This is another one, for instance, where there's a little story there. Newlywed bride had made clam chowder soup for dinner, was waiting for her husband, although she was an experienced cook, she had put everything into making the soup. Finally, he came out and sat down to dinner, and then a critical thing is missing, yeah, or not, in the implicit version. And what you find was that in the implicit version, people take a little longer to read it, but they find it more interesting because they can fill something in there. What does this mean for how we make a sense of the world around us, okay? So this leads us to the next thing, which is beliefs about politics. We all might have different political leanings. How we interpret information and how we take information a specific way to fit our beliefs is based on the fact that we don't know everything and we zone in on the things that we want to kind of believe, okay? So over here, this particular study found, for instance, that political misperceptions, regardless of whether on the left or the right, are rooted in directionally motivated reasoning, okay? Which limits the effect of corrective information, all right? Oh, I just mentioned this. So based on this sort of thing, I've sort of taken the Blinks model further to try and understand how like kind of loathing and hate towards an outgroup develops. And one of the hypotheses I've put forward is that intergroup hate in part stems from the kind of stories we tell about our hated group, which makes them seem more like, it kind of actually dehumanizes them to be a little more like fiction than real, yeah? So try to take this further in your work. The final thing I'll end with is how it, and getting to AI and online stuff as well, is how this has an impact on the spread of news, okay? Now, we're very used to citing that, you know, there's a lot of false news online, there's a lot of bots, agentic bots that are like ill-purposed and so on. And it's certainly true that that is the case, but why does it happen? So this study kind of explores why it happens. And so first of all, they said that false news very often is more novel. So it drives your interest a little bit, yeah? So false stories inspire fear or disgust or surprise, yeah? More than true stories and so on. And interesting at the final bit was that contrary to conventional wisdom, robots accelerate the spread of true and false news at the same rate, okay? Which implies that false news spreads not so much because of the bots, but because of what humans are choosing to find interesting there and push further. That's interesting. Why do we do that, right? There's all sorts of reasons why that happens. But essentially, there's something called like what's called the illusory truth effect. Yeah. Partly, I'm going to jump through because we have to get through this, but partly it has to do that sometimes with general cognitive ability of a person, okay? So the lower the cognitive ability of a person in terms of their working memory capacity, for instance, the less able they are to take in false narratives and correct information. This is kind of makes a lot of sense because if you have a larger working memory capacity, you can take in more allegedly multiple viewpoints. And there is a working chance then that you can override something that's super dominant, okay? So there's some things that just are about the way we are built and the way of what our general capacities are. Other things happen to, sorry. There are other things as well in terms of how impulsive we are in terms of our reflective practices. I'm not sure if you know this test, but it's used a lot in decision-making research, the cognitive reflection test. It's a really, really simple test. You answer one of 3 questions, okay? And you can all do it in your own heads. A bat and ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Okay. Second question, if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long will it take to make 100 machines to make 100 widgets? And in a lake, there's the patch of lily pads. Every day the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? Now, speaking in a place like Georgia Tech, I think this would be very simple. I don't imagine you would not be given the intuitive answers, which are given a lot, yeah, which is like system 1, really sort of impulsive responding. And system 2 is like the correct answers comes from just not going by the most, what the information is swaying you to do, but to sort of override it a bit by being very, very analytical about each sentence, okay? Why does this matter? Depending on your score, we can tell how likely you are to sort of go against or reject misinformation, okay? So analytical thinking ability is tied more to the to the ability to reject misinformation, regardless of what your ideology is. Okay, so we have the working memory capacity, we have your ability to reflect in ways that are analytical, to tell apart what's disinformation, what's a hoax, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Now, I can't really get into what all the types of information are, but we have a pretty much of a really huge problem as human beings, because the type of information is enormous in terms of how false they are or how intentionally bad they are, yeah? And the kind of actors who generate these kinds of false information are not just bots, but like actual human beings who might be doing it for all sorts of purposes, okay? So there are also sorts of different motives for information propagation, false information propagation, from malicious intent all the way to fun. We would have seen that in this election cycle. I don't know if you were following social media too closely, but there were tons with the new kind of AI programs we have now. There were all sorts of weird false videos being generated, mainly for a lot of the time was not necessarily malicious, but for the fact of humor. Yeah. So humor, it can also be a factor there. Now you enter into this whole thing of how we tell apart reality and fiction, all of our proclivities to be, and all of our natural dispositions which get in the way there. And you introduce something like generative AI, yeah? And of course, it kind of explodes what we see as possible, it really interferes with our ability to make these distinctions. And actually, I wouldn't even say interferes, it just pushes us towards it away. I don't think it actually gets in the way of it, it just biases us more, okay? This is a wonderful Substack by these 2 authors, Sayash Kapoor and Arvind Narayanan, who have written this wonderful good book that is just out called AI Snake Oil. They started this Substack, which really, really talks about the real risks of AI, yeah? And they outline all sorts of risks, but the focus in terms of and all of them are important, yeah? But if you look at the real risks, the misinformation aspect mainly comes from an over-reliance on inaccurate tools. We have inaccurate information processing systems, we have an inaccurate brain and mind, and now if we start to interact with inaccurate tools, it kind of exacerbates the problems in ways that we can't even imagine, really. And of course, this is now pretty well documented, yeah? Researchers are aware of it, we're aware of how it happens and influences things in the elections and other political situations, but we're very often fooled by it. So this is an example of an Irish newspaper who couldn't tell apart that a guest writer was actually an AI, okay? Sometimes people who are supposedly very well-educated and all seem to use it unknowingly. They didn't know that this could be used falsely, yeah? That the content could be false, yeah? And of course, these particular generative AI systems have a huge problem because there's no accountability, of course, and it can get really bad, like in the case over here a few years ago, where there was a sexual harassment scandal that was basically invented and a real person was named on it, okay? and the kind of culture we live in, you know how hard that will be and what knock-on effect it has in that person's lives, okay? So there are lots of concerns that people have about AI, of course, in all sorts of ways. When it comes to reality fiction distinction, I have a ton of problems with it as well. But I think the one that is really important in our case is sort of dependence lock-in. If you start to use these things to make sense of the world, what you start to do is to kind of cognitively de-skill yourself. There's a reduction of your own cognitive, social survival skills by kind of outsourcing all of this reasoning to something else, yeah? So I hope the Blinks model helps understand why that happens a lot, which is why I proposed it. And ultimately, the thing is that if the clause of boundedness is broken, yeah, and which is what's happening in the world now, we've been increasingly online spaces, it's virtual spaces, fictional spaces are becoming more and more unbound, and that's where we will see the real problem stepping in and being able to tell about what's real and what's not real, okay? Because nearly every aspect of our understanding of the world involves some form of construction on our side. If I think about the ways in which it might affect us, there are many things that could happen. One is it will limit our ability to construct narratives. It will limit our ability to appreciate narratives ourselves. It might lead to the curtailment of empathy towards anything that is unfamiliar, yeah? And in terms of real world consequences to future fiction, there might be a lot of homogeneity in future fiction if we're using all these tools to generate fiction, yeah? So those are some of the consequences that I can think of that are informed by something like the Blinks model. Okay, well, that brings me to the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. So I see, what about our friends online? Domenico, Abigail, Johan, Ben. Do you have any question for Anna?
Yeah, I have a quick question, if I may. So when you run experiments of this type, what is the typical sample that you need, and what are the figures of merit? Because I'm not familiar with this type of experiments that you mentioned before.
You mean, which ones are you, thanks for the question. Can you be specific about which experiments you're asking about? The ones with or?
So, for example, where they had to respond to questions and about the stories, whether they were credible or not. You put the percentages of how many people got it right and so on.
Yeah, so when it's that kind of literature, it's usually, nowadays it's even done kind of online. So you will ask them, you will give scenarios very often that are not sort of tangentially, it's not my own work, so I'm having to think back to what they look like. But you give scenarios that are deliberately misleading, and you give them based on whether it's, you know, right, if it's political, then it's more left wing or right wing. And you look at, you know, something that's actually false. Let's say it's a bit of a, you're asking a good question because it's a bit of a heated field, because let's say if you're looking at something politically, if you're right of the spectrum, a lot of the critiques that are coming in are that you're not assessing for biases on the other side and vice versa. Yeah, so those are there. But essentially, you look at something that is potentially like you could take any kind of sensitive topic. It could be, what do you think about vaccinations? It could be anything like that. And you put out something that is on the fringes or avowedly false, and you look at what people would think of it. Now, of course, a lot of people who would say, well, there's a lot of misinformation out there and so on, and so this is impossible to kind of assess, which is why they try to take narratives that are dominant in both the left and the right, and then they look at, you know, what is the level to which this is seen as plausible at all. So it's not just a yes or no, but what is the degree of likelihood that this is correct or this is misinformation, for instance. That's one of the ways in which they would do it, yeah? But you have to be, I think, I haven't done this work myself, but I would imagine if I would get into it, you'd have to be pretty careful about making sure that your own proclivities, or wherever you stand in on the political bend, are not interfering with the way you're asking the question, or they're not assuming that everything on your side is kosher and so on. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, but I was wondering to what extent these are reproducible.
Oh, that's a good, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think a lot of this kind of social psychological literature, it depends on what you mean by reproducible, because our knowledge about things keeps changing, right? So let's say, I'm trying to think of something neutral that won't get me into trouble if I talk about it. Let's say at the start of COVID, okay, there was a certain kind of information that was out there. So many years later now, there's more information about it. If you looked at the studies that were conducted early on about attitudes and knowledge about COVID, it would not be replicable because we have more information now, right? So if you're asking questions, and this is the problem with a lot of social psychological research, if you're asking questions about things that are topical, because knowledge tends to grow in any particular field, it might be hard to show that a specific finding is replicable. However, that shouldn't stop one from being, so let's say the CRT test, if that is really quite robust, it should be applicable in a lot of different contexts. And you should be able to see the same patterns, that people who are generally more intuitive get things wrong in a specific way. And so that it shouldn't matter that the context has changed, but that these biases that you see in relation to a certain type of reflective type should still occur. So that's what I would look to replicate. You know what I mean? Not so much the finding that is specific to a context, but that is it really true that someone who's analytical is really better in general at weighing all sorts of results or not? You know, so that's what I think you can push replicability when it comes to something like that.
Okay, any questions from the audience here? Joel?
Fascinating talk, thank you. I was thinking about, I was wondering if there are implications of your model for perception itself. So in my field, in clinical psych, a lot of times we're trying to help a client distinguish between reality and fiction. You know, the most extreme example would be a delusion or a hallucination. And there's a literature by philosopher Merleau-Ponty who argues that it may be possible to actually observe a hallucination and notice that it is different than a visual presentation that would otherwise be real.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are even accounts of people with schizophrenia initially thinking that they're hearing a voice that's telling them to be scared of who's at the door. And if they start to understand it instead as a part of themselves that's afraid, that's trying to protect them, then they can intervene in a way. And this actually can lead to, you know, a shift in the condition itself.
Yeah.
Does your model touch on that, or are there other people's work that has looked at this at the perception level?
Yeah, well, for me, this kind of work, I've always been interested in precisely that kind of psychopathology where there is this kind of reality distortion, and wonders why that, you know, did a lot of volunteer work as a student of psychology in different types of clinics and so on. And I think it helps, but it hasn't been, I think it'll help understand some aspects of it, but I'm only speculating because it's not been directly looked at. So I'm thinking of work that has looked at how certain types of narratives enter into the delusional space. So I remember after this movie, The Matrix, came out, suddenly it was interesting to see the intersection from the mental and the cultural, if you want, you know, the inner psychological space and the cultural space, because suddenly there were more reports of people reporting the delusions of persecution that were somewhat framed in the context of the Matrix. Yeah. So that's in a case there, I would say, and I don't want to overstate it because I haven't really studied it, but to me, intuitively, it makes sense that what happens in those contexts is that what is bounded, your own reality, becomes crosses over with this other space. And that's because of, could be all sorts of reasons, it's probably quite personal, but there's something about, and the Matrix might be a good example, there's something about that narrative that seems pretty plausible to you, right? it seems that we all are little batteries being controlled by an overlord. It seems like the deep state and so on. So the more the plausibility might overlap with your particular vulnerabilities of what you're seeming to be scared of, I imagine that's where it breaks down quite a bit. And suddenly it's not, and what becomes unbounded is where you don't see that as unreal anymore, right? It becomes, and that's why it is a reality distortion, and that's because but it's very particular to the context of there's something about that story that resonates with you. And we're drawn to all sorts of things in the world, right? We're drawn to different movies, different books. In some ways, it resonates with us, and it's totally fine as long as it doesn't. We can be big fans of something, but as long as we don't lose track of the fact that this is actually that space and this space, we can indulge in it. It only happens to be a problem when we cross over. So you see this in some of the literature I was reading was of like stalkers, who stalk celebrities, and they see them as not like, they read so much about them, and really they kind of, because they put so much effort into sort of knowing as much as they do, and then it crosses over into a space that is not just semantic in terms of the story, but deeply emotional, deeply preferential, like all of these kind of much more introspective aspects of the world cross over. So they don't think of that actor or actress as like, they're like, you are part of actually my social world. You are, so I would say this is the element that gets screwed with there, but not in a general way of everything is open now, but in a very tangential way, because it spills over into your real world in a very specific way. So there's the study I did many moons ago now, when I looked at how people, the whole reality fiction thing, what the Batman SpongeBob thing, I did that in a few different ways with, and I wanted to see how does this look in the human brain, right? If I give them scenarios just like that, which is like Peter met, and I use like what grown-ups would care about, things like people they had met but were real, and fictional characters like Cinderella and so on. So I gave them scenarios that were plausible, that didn't involve real interaction, like dreaming about them, reading about them, and things like speaking to them, right? So they were making these decisions, it's possible, not possible. Obviously, everyone in our sample had no reality distortions. In the first study, we found that there's a weird distinction between, it didn't seem to matter what the context was, but there was a wild difference, even though they were so similar, except for the word, the protagonist changing, Cinderella versus George Bush, let's say, that completely different systems of networks were involved. So it was almost like fiction was coded as fact, like it's like, so the semantic cognition network was areas were involved, really few, but just that. So this is like, if I tell you, oh, do you know that Harry Potter, and you're like, okay, and it's just another thing that you know. Whereas anything in relation to reality was this huge episodic self-referential system. So even though I wasn't asking anything that was self-referential or involving any kind of social cognition, really, just the fact that it was George Bush or whoever it was, we had like 20 people, it was enough to trigger the whole episodic memory system and self-referential system. So we started to think about this, like what a weird way to code for fiction and reality. And so I wrote this paper called The World According to B, really. And I was like, okay, when we think about information, how it's stored in the brain in terms of conceptual information, a story like Cinderella's story is really quite bound. You just have a lot of semantic elements there. Maybe you find something funny or something. There's a little bit of emotion, but not much. Like it's an old story, we know it well. If you think of a story you know about anyone real, it's always unfolding. There's not only a lot of information, but the type of information is really quite multimodal. So let's take the person I had there was George Bush. We know what he looks like. We know what we find him attractive or not, if we like him or not, if our mother likes him or not, what he did, how his connections are with 100 thousands of other people. It's much more, it's not just more information. It's also in some way ties in with your life. You may not be someone you know or interact with, but you are the same world. And so the next study I did was to say, well, is the system actually modulated by how relevant someone is to you? So we looked at fiction, real, but just celebrities you never met. And real, and we had people give us names of people they were close, like actual people in their lives, yeah? And same scenarios, processing things, it doesn't matter what the scenarios are, and there's this perfect modulation. So the more real a person is to you, yeah, it doesn't matter, it's not just about reality and fiction. It's like the more close someone is to you, the more real there is to you, the more it totally drives up these episodic self-referential networks in an enormous way, even though it doesn't need to. So I think in the context, very long-winded way to say, the context of certain types of mental disorders, but there's certain types of reality distortions. The distortions are quite specific, and they start to occur because I think of this relevance breakdown, right? So something fictional crosses over into space and starts to become incredibly like real to you for whatever reason, you know, and it could be because of trauma, it could be because of some overlaps or some reason for the story really just resonating with you in some particular ways. And so those would be my speculations of how that works.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Oh,
Any other questions? Yeah, go on.
Under the links framework, do dreams fall under reality or fiction?
Oh, that's a good one. Dreams are an unusual situation because they're not, I would say they fall under some, it's not really within this context at all, because it's definitely not unbounded, it's still yours, but I get what, it's a good question. I haven't thought about it in this context, but I do study the imagination more broadly. It is a space that is tied towards your reality, no doubt, but it's not a fictional, it is a real space, but it's not a fictional space. Does that make sense? But you definitely can have weird things happen there, but I haven't, it's a great question, I'm gonna have to think about that some more. But this was really developed with how we make sense of things that are really external to us, right? Like a story and so on. For dreams, it's in my model of the imagination, it's part of an altered state of your imagination that is totally normal. That happens when control centers are basically dysregulated or deregulated or downregulated is the word. And then it's spontaneous. So there's a conceptual co-activation of all sorts of regions that are happening and all sorts of reasons why it is, but it's your imagination. It's not instructed from the outside, but it's still, there's something endogenously weird happening there without a doubt. But dreams can also change a lot depending on how old you are, what stage you are, if you're having something fearful and so on. Not a dream researcher, but I would not say it's something it is part of your reality. It's not a fiction, but it's a part of your reality that is like, again, you wake up and you know it's a dream, right? You're not thinking, oh, and it's just, and somehow it's about some things in your life and so on, but it's not, still not real. So I have to think about that some more, but thank you for that.
okay, thank you, Anna. Now let's go downstairs and there will be some pizza.
What did I do? Sorry.
Bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you.